There's a quiet kind of pain that follows every no you whisper, not from others, but from somewhere deep within yourself. It arrives in silence after the decision has already been made. It's not loud, not dramatic, just a subtle ache, a soft tightening inside your chest, as though you've betrayed someone sacred. You walk away from the moment, but can't walk away from the feeling. Something in you keeps whispering, you shouldn't have done that. You know this feeling, the one that turns every boundary into a battle between peace and guilt. You say no to a friend, and the echo of it haunts you for hours. You decline an invitation, and your mind replays imaginary explanations on loop. You protect your time, but still you feel like you've taken something from someone. It's as though every act of self-honesty leaves behind the scent of wrongdoing. Few ever notice this pattern. Most assume guilt is proof of cruelty. But those who begin to awaken sense that it means something else, something older, inherited, unexamined. If this resonates with you, stay with me and subscribe to the channel, because what I'm about to reveal will change how you see guilt forever. You've been conditioned to mistake your boundaries for sins. Somewhere along the line you learned that kindness means self-sacrifice, and love means disappearing a little more each time. You were taught that harmony comes from pleasing, that peace is the absence of other people's disappointment. And so every time you say no, your nervous system interprets it as danger, as if you've broken an ancient law carved into your bones. The truth is, this guilt isn't yours. It's not your soul rebelling, it's your conditioning reacting. Most of us were trained, not taught. Trained to please before we could even pronounce the word boundary. Trained to smile when we were tired. To apologize for resting. To be agreeable, even pronounce the word boundary. Trained to smile when we were tired. To apologize for resting. To be agreeable even when our bodies said no. That's why when you try to protect your energy now, your whole being trembles like a tamed animal that flinches at its own freedom. You think the pain means you're wrong. It doesn't. It means you're undoing the leash. This is the invisible loop so many live trapped within. You say no, a storm brews inside. You start explaining, justifying, softening your tone. You want them to understand you weren't being harsh, you weren't being selfish. You just
needed to breathe. Yet every apology you give becomes another knot in the rope. The guilt tightens, not because you've hurt someone, but because you've dared to stop performing who they need you to be. It's like living inside a house of mirrors, where every reflection bends the truth of your intentions. You look into one mirror and see ungrateful, another says cold, another selfish, but none of them show the real you, the one who's simply trying to exist without
constantly dissolving into everyone else's needs. The mirrors aren't lying to harm you. They're lying because they were built by hands that never learned freedom. You've mistaken their reflection for reality. And each time you believe the mirror, you shrink a little more. You begin to edit your honesty, blur your edges, and call it kindness. But kindness without truth is submission dressed as virtue. That's what this guilt feeds on. Your confusion between love and obedience. The world rewards obedience. From childhood, you were praised for saying yes, for being easy, for not making things difficult. You learned that belonging comes at the price of silence, that to be loved, you must not disturb the peace, even if the peace costs your truth. So you performed goodness not because you were false, but because you were afraid. Afraid to lose love, afraid to be seen as unkind, afraid to stand alone. But what if this guilt was never yours to carry? What if it was planted a pattern passed down like a family heirloom, disguised as morality but born of fear? Because this is where the illusion begins. The guilt you feel does not come from your soul. It comes from conditioning, the lifelong rehearsal of obedience that began before you even had words for it. You learned early that goodness was not about truth. It was about compliance. Approval was currency, and love was the reward for those who never disrupted the peace. You weren't born afraid of disappointing others. You were trained to associate rejection with danger. Somewhere between childhood and adulthood, your nervous system became a loyal servant to the idea that safety equals submission. From your earliest days, the world taught you that harmony must be protected at any cost. You saw the frown on a parent's face when you resisted, the cold silence that followed your protests, the way affection vanished when you spoke your truth. That's how guilt became a condition. Reflex, the invisible leash that kept you close to control. You didn't choose this reflex. It was carved into you by repetition. Each good job after obedience, each disapproving sigh after resistance, etched the lesson deeper. Love must be earned through surrender. You were rewarded for saying yes. You were punished for saying no. The system never needed your authenticity. It needed your predictability. It taught you to fear the discomfort of others more than the suffocation of yourself. The church, the classroom, the family dinner table, all became stages where performance was safer than presence. And over time, you confused applause for connection. You learned to anticipate everyone's needs before your own, as though your worth depended on how well you disappeared inside them. You said yes when you were exhausted. You smiled when your chest screamed no. You apologized for needing rest, for not replying fast enough, for being quiet when the world wanted noise. You became fluent in the language of self-abandonment. And the cruelest part is you called it kindness. But here's what most people never realize. Guilt is not a moral compass. It's a memory. It remembers the times you chose truth and lost belonging. It remembers how rejection once felt like exile. So now when you protect your peace, guilt rises not to punish you, but to warn you that you're stepping outside the pattern. It's the echo of an old survival mechanism still trying to keep you safe in a world that no longer needs your compliance. Most people believe kindness means surrender, but you are beginning to see true kindness cannot exist without truth. False kindness breeds resentment, and resentment corrodes connection. The love born from self-erasure is not love, it's dependency. You cannot offer real compassion if you are constantly bleeding beneath your smile. Let me explain what really happens. The moment you recognize that your guilt isn't morality, but programming, something begins to crack open. It's like seeing the puppet strings for the first time. You realize that every automatic yes was pulled by invisible hands. Cultural, familial, societal, each tug reminding you who you were supposed to be. The daughter who never disappoints, the partner who never argues, the worker who never rests. And the moment you see those strings, you can no longer pretend they aren't there. You were taught to smile when you're tired. You were taught to give even when you're empty. You were taught to confuse guilt with love. You were taught to apologize for boundaries that protect you. You were taught that silence maintains peace, even when it kills your spirit. This training was never about goodness, it was about control. The garden of pleasing grows only when you bleed for its soil. You water it with your exhaustion and call it virtue. But that garden never truly blooms. It offers the illusion of safety, a place where you are needed but never known. You can tend to it for years and still feel starved, because the sunlight you've been surviving on is false. External approval keeps you alive, but it never nourishes you. The first time you see the falseness of this light, something shifts. You begin to taste the difference between being liked and being free. You notice how your body recoils at certain conversations, how your chest tightens when you agree out of fear. You start to recognize the lies you've spoken just to keep the peace. And in that recognition, a strange kind of clarity dawns. The guilt doesn't vanish, but now you see it for what it is, a ghost of conditioning, not the voice of conscience. At first, it's disorienting. You hesitate before every yes, hearing an echo of your old self whisper, "Don't make them upset." You feel the falseness in your own voice when you try to please. But instead of drowning in it, you begin to observe it. You watch the discomfort without running back to safety. Slowly you realize that behind the guilt there's something vast and pliant, space that feels like relief. Freedom disguised as fear. This is the awakening moment when you realize the rules you've been following were never written by truth, they were written by fear, disguised as virtue. And the first step toward liberation is not rebellion, it's recognition. Recognition that you were never the problem, the pattern was. You were not weak for obeying, you were loyal. You were trying to survive in a system that rewards invisibility. But survival is not the same as peace. And here's where it gets interesting. Once you've seen the strings, you can't go back to being the puppet. When you first begin to say no, it won't feel like empowerment. It will feel like disappearance. The parts of you that have been built on pleasing will begin to dissolve, and it will seem as though you're losing yourself. You will notice it in small ways, the awkward silence after declining an invitation, the tightness in your stomach when someone's tone shifts, the sudden doubt that floods in after you've spoken your truth. This is the withdrawal phase, not from people, but from the version of you that only existed to keep them comfortable. You're not fading away, the false self is. The silence that follows your first real no will ache. It's not just quiet, it's the sound of everything you once feared coming to meet you. Old patterns will rise from the depths, demanding that you apologize, explain, make it easier for others to accept your boundary. You'll feel the reflex to soften your stance, to offer comfort to the discomfort you didn't cause. Stay. Don't rush to fix it. This is where freedom begins, not in changing their reaction, but in holding your own. Let the discomfort teach you where you've been chained. Let it reveal how deeply you've confused love with safety. You'll wonder if you're becoming cold, detached, maybe even selfish. You'll look at the space that opens up when you stop overgiving and think, have I lost my kindness? No. What you're losing is compliance. You're shedding the reflex to disappear. Sacred honesty often feels like cruelty to the parts of you that were trained to please. But there's nothing selfish about truth. What looks like distance is actually integrity, the space where authenticity can finally breathe. This process is not rebellion, it is remembrance. You're not breaking your nature, you're returning to it. You were born with a sense of inner rhythm, when to reach and when to rest. That rhythm was drowned beneath expectations and applause. Saying no is how you remember the music of your own being. You're not withdrawing from the world, you're stepping back into alignment with it. At first, it will feel like exile. You'll sit in rooms that used to feel safe and realize you no longer belong there. Conversations that once filled you will now sound hollow. The people who relied on your endless yes may call you distant, changed, unkind, and they'll be right, you have changed. You are no longer performing kindness at the expense of your peace. You're learning the difference between helping and enabling, between compassion and compliance. You begin to see that every no is also a yes to your truth, your rest, your clarity. Every refusal becomes a quiet act of devotion, a way of saying to life, I choose to be honest over being liked. There's a sacred power in that. Each time you hold your boundary, you reclaim a fragment of yourself that was once given away for love. And slowly you begin to understand that your peace is not a gift to others. It's a responsibility to yourself. It helps to think of this as the cocoon phase. You enter darkness not to vanish, but to change form. The guilt you feel is the shell cracking, the sound of transformation, not failure. The world outside might not understand what's happening to you, but that's because metamorphosis is always private. Caterpillars don't explain their silence, they surrender to it. Inside that stillness, the old structure dissolves so the new one can emerge. This is what your guilt is doing. It's dissolving the false self that lived to be needed. Some days you'll feel like you're swimming against a current that's been pulling you for years. That's because your entire life has been an act of resistance against your own truth. When you finally stop fighting and let the current carry you, something extraordinary happens. Peace doesn't come from effort anymore, it comes from permission. You stop trying to be good and start being real. You learn that surrender isn't giving up, it's coming home. And yes, people will leave. Some will drift away quietly. Others will resist your change, accuse you of becoming distant, ungrateful, different. Let them. The ones meant to walk with you will recognize your silence as strength, not rejection. Those who truly see you will stay. The rest were only attached to the version of you that kept them comfortable. Losing them is not loss, it's alignment. You might fear that in protecting your energy you'll lose your heart. But you'll soon discover that kindness doesn't die when boundaries appear, it deepens. True kindness begins where self-erasure ends. It's no longer a performance, it's an overflow. You become capable of love that doesn't drain you, generosity that doesn't demand depletion. That is the paradox of healing by turning inward. You become more available to the world. There will come a season when your life feels barren, when you seem still and unseen like a tree in winter. But beneath that stillness, new roots are growing. You're not dying, you're preparing for bloom. The quiet is not emptiness, it's gestation. The space you once feared becomes sacred ground. And in that stillness, guilt begins to fade, replaced by something softer grace. Because eventually, you realize that guilt was never your enemy, it was your initiation, the bridge between obedience and truth. You realize that guilt was never your enemy, it was your initiation, the bridge between obedience and truth, beneath the performance. But here's the thing, what happens after you stop apologizing for your peace changes everything. There comes a moment, quiet but absolute, when the guilt begins to loosen its grip. You notice it in the way you breathe, slower, steadier. You notice it in the pauses between words, where once there was apology. You realize that peace has stopped asking for permission to exist. The ache that once followed every no begins to soften.
New grace. You start to understand that boundaries were never walls, they were prayers whispered in the language of self-respect. Give yourself permission to rest, to refuse, to not explain, to be misunderstood and still be at peace. Give yourself permission to choose quiet over chaos, truth over approval, depth over display. Let every decision you make be an act of self-trust, not self-defense. You've spent a lifetime earning love by disappearing. Now it's time to let your presence
be your offering. There will come a time when your no carries no guilt, only grace. When silence will speak louder than compliance. When the softness you once apologized for becomes your greatest strength. You'll no longer chase understanding, you'll embody clarity. The world will still make its demands, but you will answer differently. You will serve but from overflow, not emptiness. You'll give but without leaving yourself behind. Because the truth is, the world doesn't
need your exhaustion. It needs your authenticity. It needs people who can say no without resentment, who can rest without shame, who can love without losing themselves. You were never meant to save others by sacrificing your wholeness. You were meant to remind them what wholeness looks like. You cannot keep dimming your light to comfort the blind. You cannot keep saying yes to your own depletion. You cannot keep mistaking peace for guilt. Every time you silence your truth to keep the peace, you teach the world a lie about love. And every time you choose honesty over comfort, you remind the world that love and truth were never separate. You are the lighthouse now, standing firm, not chasing ships, simply shining. You no longer beg to be seen. You allow yourself to be witnessed. The storms will still come, but you will not be moved. You'll know that stillness isn't passivity, it's power. You'll burn like a sacred flame, steady, warm, unapologetic. You'll understand that to glow softly in your truth is the most radical form of service there is. And then quietly you'll return to the world. But this time you'll walk among people differently. You'll speak less from duty, more from devotion. You'll give because it feels holy, not because it feels required. You'll stop performing goodness and start radiating it. You'll notice that your presence heals more than your effort ever did. You'll realize that solitude was never separation, it was preparation. You were never cruel for protecting your peace. You were becoming whole. Every boundary you set was a love letter to your future self. Every silence you kept was a promise that you would no longer abandon yourself for belonging. You will carry this knowing, like breath, quiet, constant, sacred. And when the world asks you who you've become, you will smile and say someone who no longer confuses guilt with love, because the awakened do not say no to others. They say yes to truth.